Yo, man, can you see the mics, man?
Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from Pro Football Network. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, obviously we didn't end up doing the show last night for, again, obvious reasons. Did you continue to doom scroll, or did you end up finding something to make you feel better about what was going on?
It was a little bit of both. I mean, I stopped constantly checking Twitter. I turned off SportsCenter, which turned out to be kind of a shame because how Scott Van Pelt and Ryan Clark handled everything was a masterclass, essentially, in how to respond to something tragic like this. And for people unfamiliar, which would be kind of surprising, but I'm sure there are some people unfamiliar. Last night in the Cincinnati Bengals Buffalo Bills game, Damar Hamlin tackled T. Higgins, got up, and then collapsed back down to the ground after a very harrowing series of medical interventions, which included CPR and an IV and apparently AED. They loaded him into an ambulance and brought him to the Level 1 Trauma Care Center at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. Pretty alarming stuff. And kind of one of those situations where, because I'm used to, and I'm sure other people can feel the same way, I'm used to very constant updates on just a number of things as situations happen to evolve. And this is just not the kind of thing that has constant updates. You know, we learned that he went to the hospital. We learned that his pulse had been restored, but he needed assistance with breathing. We learned that he was sedated. We learned that he was in critical condition. And that was it. And that's what we were attempting to tease out over the course of a number of hours, essentially, until the NFL held their own phone conference or a conference call with media around midnight Eastern. So I wanted to know more, knowing that I wasn't going to know more. But for the most part, I was able to close down my tweet deck, which, if people have seen my tweet deck, it's like 19 columns of tweets. It's probably bad for my mental health, but it does keep me up to date. I turned off the TV, and I had some notifications on for some key accounts that helped me know if something was going on, and I would do some other things, then occasionally kind of check back into the work Slack or check back into what was happening. But I was still up until 4 a.m. Trying to gather my thoughts. So a mix of both.
I ended up going the route of, I watched a little bit of Scott Van Pelt, and I knew that there wasn't going to be anything that, like, you and I had made the call at early. Like, we weren't doing it. Yeah. There's no way. But I
think it was like 5 minutes after, like, it was like, this is...
Yeah. It's like, there's no way that this is going to go well. But yeah, it was like, I watched a little bit of Scott Van Pelt, but otherwise I went to original Iron Chef and Anthony Bourdain stuff, and decided that was going to be the way that I was going to spend my evening. And if something happened, our mighty Discord would let me know, because I wasn't and for all the fighting on Twitter, I saw nothing that I needed to respond to. There was nothing that my voice was going to be able to do to add to the conversation of something that I only know a little about. It was just
right.
Yeah, it was much better to just step aside and let families and everyone else kind of deal with what was going on. Attention people are... I was about to do the cursing thing, but, like, attention people were going to seek attention, and there wasn't anything you were going to be able to do about that. So we're going to get into the show.
There was just a quick... I mean, there's like a lot of... And, you know, some people were pushing back against it, but there's just like a lot of, oh my God, this is an awful take, and, you know, we were boosting it and stuff like that. And normally I actually don't care as much about that as most people. Like, oh my God, stop like quote tweeting Jason Whitlock or whatever because his awful takes get more attention. That's what he gets paid for. And it's like, you got to push back sometimes. Here it was just like, whatever, man. I just don't need to see any of this.
Yeah. I mean, it's not. It's different between seeing it in a movie and seeing it in real life.
Yeah,
and it sucks. You know, there's not much. All you can really do is try to figure out what to do next time when something like this happens. Because I've seen based on the description of what had gone on, and we're going to get into the show here in just a moment. Based on what I'd seen, this was very similar to something I had watched on TV once. Because this was something very similar happened to a professional wrestler. I forget if I was flipping channels or whatever, but the wrestler Jerry the King Lawler who's typically an announcer, ended up getting into the ring for some reason, had a wrestling match. It was like a tag team match, went back to announcing, and then a few minutes later, his heart stopped and he just collapsed. And they happened to have a doctor immediately there, was able to like help get him back to having a pulse, but his heart had stopped for a considerable amount of time, and they brought him back to the back and were working on him and everything. And he had even said as a tweet, "I have a pretty good idea what this is." I was like, it's very possible that it was a blunt force trauma, to the chest causing the problem, but it's unfortunate, and it's crazy when something like this happens. And the fact that there was medical help immediately is wonderful. But hopefully things end up working out for him. I'm not going to do the normal shilling thing. I've just got a couple people to thank real quick. I want to thank Andrew Swan over on Patreon and Isaiah Raid over on Patreon. Thank you guys so much. Patreon people got an additional clip show. If you like the Christmas clip show, patreon.com/NorseCode has the newest clip show for you. It's available and people seem to like it. Let's get on to the actual show. And obviously the Damar Hamlin thing is what everyone is thinking about, everyone's talking about. If you are not interested in listening to this and you've heard enough, I will have a timestamp for you in the show description. Just you can skip ahead to the review of the Packers game. But the Damar Hamlin thing is interesting from a number of aspects. Most notably, it's that philosophy of the show must go on that seems to haunt events like this. And I remember in 1997, and I realize I'm the second podcast you've been on today that has mentioned this, but in 1997, the injury to the Lions player with his neck basically it broke. Mm-hmm. It was terrifying, and I was old enough to remember that very vividly. And so when the announcers last night were saying they couldn't remember an ambulance being on the field, it's like, no, I remember that crystal clear, because that was terrifying. That was nuts. That was the maybe you don't do football anymore if you can end up like that sort of play. And that was terrifying. And they continued to play, and it was one of those I don't know how you do that sort of things. It's right up there with when I was a kid and I was watching high school hockey for the first time. My uncle was big into it, and he brought me out there. I was like, oh, okay, great. And I watched a guy get checked into the boards right in front of me, and I watched a tooth or two come out, and I was like, oh God, well, that's going to be something I remember for the rest of my life. It was like that. It's something that sticks with you. It's horrifying. Yeah. Right in front of you. And the idea that the game must go on, that things must continue, there seems to be an argument now as to whether or not this is something that came from the NFL, or if this is something that was never supposed to be. Maybe this was something in order to make it so that the EMTs could leave before the fans did, in order to make sure that the vehicle could. It seems like there's a lot of, pardon my French, covering your ass right now.
Yeah, it's very strange. So I wrote in my piece about the NFL's reputation for resisting any changes to the schedule. I didn't go into detail in the piece as to kind of why the NFL would be as resistant as it is. There are obviously kind of two big reasons. One is that, as tasteless as it might seem, it still draws a profit. I think that's kind of the baser reason. The second, of course, is that logistically organizing an NFL game and rescheduling an NFL game or canceling an NFL game, that's an extraordinary cost in time, resources, and money. These are $1 million operations. They sometimes have some delicate scheduling surrounding them, whether that has to do with the flights of the players, the coaches, the personnel, the staff, or the schedule involved in the cameras used to shoot the game, the equipment used. A lot of the equipment is rented, not bought, and so you just don't have access to it because that equipment has already been claimed. Same with the stadium. Sometimes the stadium is just going to be booked up on days that you're not using it already, and so there are legitimate logistical reasons to have inertial momentum to keep the game going. So long as you presuppose that it is worth having the game, right? The question is usually not now or later; it's very often now or never. And so, with that in mind, the NFL has a significant reason to have a default towards making sure that the games run on schedule. I think that obviously they push too hard in general. I think that, for example, I'm going to remember forever, attending the Seahawks Vikings game at TCF Bank Stadium at minus 25 degrees wind chill. But also that was a danger to fans that should not have happened. It was an outdoor stadium, right? And so it's kind of wild, the things that they'll do in order to make sure that the game continues. But that ethic has permeated through the NFL more than almost any other sport. I mean, the NBA has been resistant, the MLB has been resistant. And as Courtney Cronin pointed out on, I believe it was Around the Horn, the only reason that the NFL delayed after September 11th, and famously they didn't do that after the JFK assassination. Pete Rozelle purportedly had a conversation with the Kennedys, I think it was his press secretary. The Kennedys famously loved football, played football at the White House lawn, grew up playing football. And the press secretary or whoever it was, some official within the administration said, football is Kennedy's game. He'd want it to continue. And then it continued and they drew an enormous backlash for that sort of thing. And rightly so. Fast forward like 40 years later and the NFL is determining whether or not to play week 2 following the September 11th attacks. They were going to play in week 2, but the players just said no. And there are shades of that in this response here, where it very much seems like, and I want to use my words pretty carefully here because the NFL has kind of denied, I shouldn't say kind of, has denied this, but it very much seems like the NFL instituted, say, a 5-minute warm-up after the player injury, I think is probably the way that they would think of it, had been removed from the field and you could restart play. And it seems like the coaches said no. It seems like Zach Taylor and Sean McDermott said absolutely not. I wanted to use my words carefully here because Troy Vincent, the vice president of football operations at the NFL league office and a former player, said categorically that did not happen, that the league did not communicate to officials that they should go through a 5-minute warm-up. The problem is, and I think a lot of Vikings fans have turned in the other direction when it comes to Joe Buck. They used to hate him a lot. Some still do. But now I think a lot of people kind of appreciate him for who he is. But one thing that I think that even a lot of people who hate Buck will understand is that he's not stupid, and that he would not report. And he reported several times, 4 times over the course of the ESPN broadcast, that the league had communicated that there would be a 5-minute warm-up before a return to play. And he said, quote unquote, to get ready. This comes from the league itself. These are direct quotes from Joe Buck. Not only did Buck say this, ESPN Deportes said it, and Westwood One said it. So it is unlikely that nothing was communicated to the announcers, to the commentators, as they updated the rest of the world on what was going to happen following the game. That said, I also don't think necessarily that Troy Vincent is knowingly lying, because getting caught in a lie like that is an even worse PR disaster, and the NFL knows it. They are not the world's best PR machine, but they are extraordinarily good at controlling language. The reason that they're a bad PR machine is not because of how poorly their PR is managed or how poorly they pick their PR personnel or how they craft their statements. The reason their PR is bad is because they make bad decisions and have to cover up for it. That's a different thing. The PR operation of the NFL is remarkable, and they know that lying here, if they get caught in a lie, is a big problem. So now we're left to resolve two seeming contradictions. The NFL has a strong incentive not to lie here, and it is unlikely that multiple broadcast partners quoted the NFL as saying that there would be a 5-minute warm-up when there would not, in fact, be one. Likely what had happened is that Troy Vincent was communicating with the rest of the higher-ups of the front office and did not communicate down the chain to tell officials or to tell broadcast partners what was happening. And so someone else, and there is, I don't want to say his name, but there is a person who's tasked with that kind of communication. I'm not saying that this is the person who said it, right? So this is why I don't want to say his name. But there are people who are tasked with that responsibility, and they may not have talked to each other, right? And so they may have said, "Hey, the protocol here is to have kind of a period of 5-minute warm up after an extended delay, and then you get back to it. You need players to get ready." So that may be what happened, some sort of miscommunication. But the problem is, of course, that whoever was in charge of that level of communication down to the broadcast partners in the league understands what the NFL is likely to do in that scenario. And our understanding of what the NFL is likely to do in that scenario is colored by our history of interacting with the NFL. And that's why it was so easy to believe that the NFL said that to Buck. That said, if someone has skepticism about what Vincent said, I would entertain that. I think that that's totally fair. I think it is much more likely that, and ESPN defended themselves. They released a statement saying, "Hey, we understand the sensitivity of the situation. We would not just say the league said something multiple times." It's very much, to me, it seems extremely likely that something was communicated from an official position to the broadcast partners. And it's very easy to believe that 5-minute warm-up was part of the conversation because of the history of the NFL, like you said, having the mentality that the show must go on. And that phrase comes from theater, which is more about kind of resilience, but it's really kind of more the machine needs to keep running, I think is maybe the better imagery to evoke here, because it is a profit-making machine, which is one of the other things that my piece touches on about how the NFL continues to fail its players in protecting its players from a safety perspective, in rewarding the players for the revenue that they generate. And in terms of negotiations, the NFL is just in such a dominant position over labor that it is difficult for labor to get what's due. And because of that, players are putting their lives on the line in a very literal sense without receiving just compensation for the value that they generate. So there's all of that it gets rolled into the piece. I talk about it there. I also talk about the failure of the NFL to have an effective communication plan, because the NFL has the greatest obligation to its players, but they also have an obligation to the people watching the game. And their inability to communicate what was going to happen or how things were going to happen led to this 43 minutes of essentially dead time where we were left with an understanding that the NFL wanted to continue playing. So the NFL communicated, whether or not it was explicit, whether or not they intended to communicate this message, they communicated that they were trying to find a way to play the game.
When Booger McFarlane is your voice of reason for an evening, something has gone horribly wrong.
Yeah. It's like when you're at a spot where your breaking news guy, Adam Schefter, is the one attempting to make sure that we appropriately humanize the situation. Man, are you in a rough spot?
Yeah.
It is. The NFL massively mishandled this communication, and in doing so, they did a disservice not just to Damar Hamlin and his family, but also to the players that are watching the game, the players that are in the game, that limbo is itself a form of harm, right? Because not knowing what's coming next for you, that unmooring, that alienated sense of kind of where you need to be, has its own impact. I mean, the players just saw something traumatic, and now they don't even know whether or not they should mentally prepare to play. And I'm glad that the players and the coaches chose essentially not to play. I mean, it very much feels like they made the choice here, so that's how I'm going to refer to it, even though I cannot definitively say that the call was made by the coaches instead of the players. That's very much what it seems to be the case. And the reason is twofold. One, not to infantilize players or the decisions that they make. I want them to be empowered to make decisions, of course. But a decision to play through something so that you can distract yourself from the concern and worry that you have strikes me, and I'm not a mental health professional, but strikes me as potentially harmful. But the second is that if you're distracted and you're playing football, you'll get hurt. I mean, that's just
they've said it before for many sports, whether it's fighting, whether it's basketball, whether it's football. If you're not focused on what you're doing, especially with football, you will get killed out there. And I realize that's a poor taste of words, but that's literally what can happen. You're not thinking as you're going across the middle.
Yeah, exactly. You don't protect yourself. Your muscles don't respond to brace for impact. You don't keep your head on a swivel and see where contact is coming from. You miss your cues. You miss, making sure that you have appropriate technique on tackling form. X, Y, like all kinds of things.
The pro game is so fast. The pro game is just so fast.
Yeah, and it's actually really difficult to get that across for. And I hate, because it sounds like I'm trying to pull some sort of, access card here, and I'm not. It's an experiential difference of being at the sideline of even like an SEC game, much less an NFL game. Being at the sideline of an NFL game and seeing and hearing all of the collisions and impacts and trying to get out of the way of a player going full speed heading towards the sideline. That player is coming in faster than you think, because they look like they're 5'10" and they're 6'4". And so your inability to judge speed, size, and distance becomes a potential problem. It is so difficult to communicate that when players say that they're experiencing car crashes every week, they aren't exaggerating.
It's funny. I watch a lot of UND hockey, a bunch of college hockey. And when I started going to pro games every once in a while when I started getting a little bit more into the wild, and my eyes weren't ready for like just how fast things move. Because the college game is played at a certain speed, certain level, whatever. But all of the best of those people are now playing in a different spot. You're just, oh my God, I am not like prepared for what is going on here. Like the live version of it, especially. I
mean, you take a pool of the strongest and fastest people you can find, put them all together, give them better nutrition, better strength training, and allow them to reach physical maturity at 27, 28, 29, where they are faster and stronger. It is impossible to communicate the level of speed and power on display, which is why, like, back to the original point, you can't play distracted.
Yeah. Bum Chillips on Twitter had said
Spencer Hall, phenomenal account.
Had said something that was pretty fitting. I felt one of my favorite movies, probably my favorite comedy now that I'm thinking about it, is Blazing Saddles. Incredibly inappropriate movie, but it's funny, but it's not joking about a lot of things. And in this case, it's incredibly true. The tweet was, the damn near lost a $400 handcart scene in Blazing Saddles was never a joke. There's a scene where they send off to employees, I will say, not the term that they use, but the term I'll use in this particular instance, and two expendable employees down to check out what's happening further down the track. And instead of like helping instead of helping out the employees, whatever, their first concern was the track, so they could keep going. They could get the handcart back, because the handcart's expensive. Meanwhile, they have to find their own way out of the quicksand. And it felt very much like that during that discussion about how there was going to be 5 minutes. Meanwhile, you had players doing the 1,000-yard stare on the sidelines.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly tone deaf. And when it comes out and the NFL finds someone to put the official blame on, and they're forced to resign in a huff and take the and take and take all the blame for it, it'll be unfortunate because this was a failure from the top down as to what you do in this sort of situation. And it's fortunate that the coaches recognize there is no way that we could play another 3/4 of this. There's absolutely no way.
Yeah. I mentioned two examples of player injuries occurring during an NFL game. One was Chuck Hughes, the receiver for the Lions, who had actually died, had a heart attack on the field. I believe he was not contacted, but had a heart attack. They were playing. Dick Buckus actually is the one who waved in the paramedics. And it was late in the fourth quarter, and they decided to finish the game. And 75 minutes later, and you can hear apparently the sirens going out of the stadium over the broadcast. Then also the Reggie Brown example that we mentioned. Also late in the fourth quarter, players paralyzed. They decided to finish out the game. There is a difference, I guess. I don't love it because it feels kind of callous because at some point you're trying to find where the line is. But there is a difference when there's only a couple minutes left in the game versus 3/4 left in the game. 3/4 and I guess like 5.5 minutes. That probably informed a lot of this, the player's decision or the coach's decision to continue playing. But in those previous two examples, the players and the coaches did not exercise a choice of any kind, right? So that probably plays a role in here. But yeah, I think that it is extremely likely that if the coaches hadn't mutually decided not to continue playing, that they would have put the players at risk to continue playing. The Bills' defense was already on the field.
Yeah, it would have been the Ryan Shazier situation.
Yeah,
and the NFL got blowback for that for sure.
Yeah, and it's a lot. I mean, these players spend so much time with their teammates. They form relationships that are stronger than a lot of friendships. And seeing that happen has to be remarkable. It has to be awful.
Yeah. So I think that's going to end the conversation on that. Obviously, our thoughts are with Damar Hamlin. There is a GoFundMe that exists that is a part of a toy drive that he's a part of. Make sure that it's for the right one. We're recording this on Tuesday evening, and I believe it's like at 4 million, which is impressive. Like that'll be something that would be something really nice to wake up to see that was people's reaction to what had happened, and we can only hope for the best. Let's go to a review of the Packers game. Obviously, this isn't going to be very long. This was a game where the Vikings were trounced. I've always said that the second worst injury outside of your quarterback is your center. And when you're down to your third string center who's never taken a snap in an NFL game, you're going to have a rough day. And the Vikings had a rough day. We're going to have a combination of discussion and mailbag for this, which brings us to the center discussion, which we can talk about the IR designations now. Nick Howard asks, we're bringing in fans from the stands that can play center, right?
I mean, the Vikings did just sign Greg. I don't actually even know how to pronounce his last name. Greg Mance? Let's see what Wikipedia has to say. It doesn't have a pronunciation guide. That's wonderful. Who I remember being an undrafted free agent way back in, it was for the Texans. It was probably 7, 8 years ago. Who has started a number of games, started a full season for the Texans actually because of an injury. And they had just signed him off of, I want to say, the Browns practice squad. So close, close. A little bit more experience than most fans in the stands have, but I actually think that this is probably a pretty good signing given his history of play. Not only has he played a lot of center, I think he played center all 4 years at Toledo as well. Not bad. I mean, he's a practice squad guy, so he's not amazing, right? But he's not bad. And I think more than Chris Reed, he probably can understand cadence a little bit better. So that seems to be kind of more critical. I'm not confident that a fan in the stands is going to understand like the fifth version of the silent count and make sure that Ezra Cleveland doesn't false start because of something that you didn't or did do.
But I mean, if we were going to do it, now would certainly be the time to do it.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Vikings.com has it pronounced Mance.
Mance.
Mants.
Perfect.
So, good. So, what about... so, we had a couple of major injuries in the Vikings game, and we now have some IR designations as well.
Yeah. There were a number of. Let me work through them because I know that the Vikings are left with one extra roster spot. I don't know what they're going to do with that, but they emailed out an announcement on IR like they always do. Let me see if I can pull it up. Yeah. So the Vikings placed Austin Schlottman and Brian O'Neill on injured reserve. We both heard after the game that they had pretty significant injuries, so it was reasonably confident something like this would happen. They didn't announce the IR until later in the day. So on the Minnesota football party, we'd mentioned that it was pretty unlikely that we're going to see Brian O'Neill or Austin Schlottman again. And it sounded like which Schlottman, I think, had a broken tibia or something along those lines. Brian O'Neill had significant hamstring injury. And so we wouldn't see O'Neill at the earliest until the NFC Championship game. And this pretty much confirms that. They also signed Greg Mance to the active roster, signed former Rams offensive tackle Bobby Evans to the practice squad. And in order to make room for Bobby Evans, released linebacker Chris Garrett from the practice squad. So there's still, because there were 2 IR moves and 1 player signed to the active roster, there's still 1 room left on the active roster. Don't know what they're going to do with that. But it's interesting that they didn't elevate somebody from the practice squad to the roster. Probably not Chris Garrett, right? But, they could have activated somebody from the practice squad to the active roster and then brought Bobby Evans in on the practice squad. Don't know what's going on there, but yeah, they made a number of moves right as the season is closing.
Well, this wasn't a good game for the Vikings in particular. This was a game that had a couple, like at the beginning of it, there were a couple of kind of odd penalties that weren't, and it looked like the team couldn't get their footing out there, which brings me to Ingram's left foot, who asks, what type of warm-up failure did the team have? Is this prep issue systemic? I know you don't want to pull something in practice. However, you would think you would cut hard enough to run into this during pregame.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that when they practiced pregame, the footing was fine, and it wasn't until the game had actually started that they'd started slipping. And it's not as if, you do the pregame warmups and then you immediately start playing. There's a significant amount of time between the two. And so that first version sounds suspicious, but it's not. There's a bunch of time in between. And so that seems to be what happened. It leads to this whole thing about cleats. And I'm so annoyed at this. First, I'm annoyed at how the Vikings, mostly the players, the coaching staff seem to handle it fairly well. But I'm annoyed at how the Vikings handled it, right? I'm also annoyed at people responding to me about it. It's like you point out something, and very often it seems like, especially fans of opposing teams after like a win or something like that, it seems like when you point out something or a mistake or some sort of cosmic coincidence, right? Like, man, they really... it really sucks that the refs did this thing or this thing or this thing. They're like, man, you lost 41-17. It wasn't that close. It wasn't that one call is not going to matter. It's like, I didn't say it mattered, man. I said that this is a problem. I don't know what you want me to say. And that's what happened here. So the Vikings were prepared for the surface to be slick and to not be able to get much purchase on it. And so they had recommended to the players on the team, Dennis Ryan, the equipment manager, recommended to wear 7 stud cleats instead of the standard 5 stud cleats. That makes sense. And I understand why players kind of are resistant to that, right? So throughout the practice week, it sounded like a number of players, Justin Jefferson in particular, but from my understanding, also TJ Hawkinson and maybe Adam Thielen wore their standard cleats throughout practice and then started the game in their standard cleats, which is what led to some of these footing errors. KJ Osborne always wore the 7 stud cleats. So some people had asked me, like, hey, why did they even care? Like, why did they wear the 5 stud cleats? And it's like, well, have you met athletes? It's just like the most extreme example of this is, of course, Antonio Brown caring so much about his helmet that he refused to show up to camp without the right helmet, which had been at that point no longer manufactured because it no longer meets NFL helmet guidelines. And Antonio's helmet in Pittsburgh had been grandfathered in. And so you have to find a certified new helmet, which they ended up getting off of like a movie set or something, which is wild. That's the most extreme version of it. But players are very particular about their equipment. There's practical reasons to care. More studs on a cleat means that it is heavier and it can feel a little bit slower. That matters because of the precise timings that happen to occur in NFL games. Those cleats are not going to be as broken in. They're just not going to be as comfortable to wear as your standard cleats that you're used to wearing. And also kind of the feedback you get from equipment matters. Like how you feel when you're operating and playing, and what your body responds to in terms of its cues, how much force to put down, what to do here, what to do there, relies on your senses reacting before you can consciously make a decision. That is why you practice. It's to form habits and to develop muscle memory. What's muscle memory? It is the ability of your body to act before you consciously make the choice for it to act that way. And for that to happen, it takes in sensory information and response, right? And so not having a piece of equipment that you're comfortable with, that makes sense that you would not want to do that if you had had the choice, right? I understand why they didn't want to. That doesn't mean I understand why they chose not to, right? There's a difference. And I think you probably trust your head coach and your equipment manager when they say this sort of thing, even though your warm-ups had seemed to have gone fine, because you didn't know that the warm-ups were going to go fine during your practice week. So as a result, the Vikings slipped all over the field. Multiple players fell down in routes. If the offensive linemen were also wearing the wrong cleats, that means that they didn't get as much purchase when they pushed off. They didn't get as much strength in the base, and so they couldn't absorb contact or bring contact into defensive linemen, and it would hurt their play as well. Although that doesn't get expressed on film in terms of slips and falls. It tends to get expressed in, wow, that guy looks a little bit weaker than we're used to seeing him. And so, it's just how sports work. Everything moves from the ground up. And in football, they always talk about how important it is to have your feet right. And if you can't do that, then you cannot perform any of the base football techniques you need in order to perform as a high-level athlete. So, it sucked. I think it had a pretty reasonable impact on the game to say that this was something that mattered. I think it did matter. I don't think it's the one difference. There was not one difference. When you get blown out, you did a number of things wrong. Very rarely is it like the 77-0 Bears over Washington, historic game where it's just like, the Bears knew that you were going to play the same defense you did 3 weeks ago, and they introduced the wing T offense, and Washington had no answer. It wasn't like that. This is not how the NFL works anymore. It was a number of things that went wrong. One of those things is the cleats, and the cleats are a really good example of everything that went wrong, because it's an example of how preparation was at the core of the Vikings' failures against the Packers, because not only it didn't mean that they didn't have footing and that they didn't practice or play well, or they didn't have the right timing down, because if you change the way players respond to equipment, they might be running slower or explode out of the brakes a little bit different, and you just need to spend a little bit of time getting that timing correct. Not only all of that, but also the center didn't know the snap count, right? Like that's also an example of poor preparation. What do they do when Justin Jefferson gets taken away by double teams? Well, they should pepper their other targets. It seems like they weren't prepared to do that. So it's a really good example of all the things that went wrong in the game. And it's fun to focus on because it provides us with like a thing that you can point to that's very obvious and clear as to kind of how the Vikings failed to prepare, as essentially an avatar for all of the other things that went wrong in the preparation cycle.
It is amazing to just look at and go, well, clearly it was the cleats' fault. Well, yeah, it was that and a million other things. Do we boil that down to head coaching? Like, would this have gone better if if Kevin O'Connell was more stern of a coach and said, no, this is how we're doing it? I guess if he had more Mike Zimmer in him.
Yeah, that's I saw a couple of people mention that, and I think it's worth discussing, right? Because it goes down to how effective a coaching style can be when you have a good piece of coaching advice and the players resist it. How does a coach respond? In a way, yeah, that gets down to coaching, because either he should have instituted it as a policy, right, which is certainly well within his rights as a coach and the nature of the relationship that's been established there, or he had not developed enough of the kind of trust with his players that, and this is not to say that locker room doesn't trust him or that they're mutinying, but there's levels of trust. You can have a high degree of trust in someone, and if they ask you to do something you're not used to doing, you may still not do it because you don't trust them as much as somebody else who might be able to convince you to do that because you trust them. So it's not like that, but like he has not developed a high enough level of trust to voluntarily ask them to do something that they're not used to doing, that they're uncomfortable doing, and expect them to do it, right? And so those are both related to coaching. One is related to coaching styles and approaches. The other one relates to basically his authority, right? In a very little a sense, not big A authority, but little a authority in the way that he speaks to players and how much they kind of respect when he asks them to change their behavior in a pretty significant way. So those are both examples of ways that you could say that he didn't really approach his coaching strategy heading into the season the right way, or didn't coach well enough during the season. And I know that sounds weird because he coached really well to get to a 12-4 record, but just in terms of the way that we think of a coach in every aspect, and not just in the way that we think of a coach as somebody who manages the play callers or calls plays himself and manages the clock. Somebody who develops a relationship with his players so that he can move the team in the right direction and make sure that the team has a shared vision. Like that kind of coaching, there may have been some stumbles along the way, even though the team is mostly bought in. So that could all be the case. Or we could just make the argument that it was important for him to ask instead of tell, because the more he asks and the more he's right when he asks, the more going forward the players will enthusiastically buy in, right? Because there's a difference between telling someone to do something and having the authority basically to say, you're going to do it because I told you to do it, because that is the contractual relationship that we have, versus asking someone to do it and having them do something because they can do it, more enthusiastically. And I know that with a cleat decision, how much of a difference is enthusiasm going to make? But it's important that he at some point makes sure that he communicates that players are buying in, they're opting into all of these coaching decisions, and they'll execute those decisions with a lot more, vigor, right? And a lot more enthusiasm and energy. And so it could be that he was doing that. And when you do that, along the way, there's going to be some problems, and that's one of those problems. So it could be this is overall a good thing that he was doing, but there are some costs to that, and this is one of those costs. Or it could just be a bad thing, and it could be a sign that, there's more that he needs to develop as a coach.
Let's go to Jack Rackham, who asks, we all know that the defense is what it is. However, for all the talent on the offensive side of the ball, they are massively inconsistent. They're massively inconsistent, disappearing in large chunks of the game. In my humble opinion, this is the team's biggest hindrance. Do you agree, and how do you fix it?
From a play-to-player, drive-to-drive perspective, the Vikings are certainly one of the more inconsistent teams. If you take a look at measures like drive success rate and compare it to points per drive, both of those are fairly predictive going forward of themselves, of future wins, and of each other. And the Vikings, last I checked, this was a couple of weeks ago, so it could be different. The Vikings do have a fairly big difference in their drive success rate versus the points scored per drive. They had a much higher points scored per drive as a ranking than they did drive success rate, which tells us that they're winning off of explosive plays, or some sustained drives, but not doing it from drive to drive to drive. The best teams offensively are the ones that do both, that have a lot of explosive plays, that have a high drive success rate, that have a lot of points per game, and so are peppering in between big plays first downs, right? Like the Chiefs are number one in explosive plays per drop back and are number one in first downs per drop back. They're a good offense, and when their explosive plays aren't there, they're still marching down the field, right? So that's not what the Vikings are. When they score, it tends to be because of some kind of not explosive play, but an extended drive that you're not going to see for like the rest of the game. So they are disappearing a little bit. And I've talked about this a little bit in the past. I don't know entirely what's always behind it. I suspect that there's some level of lagging in-game adjustments. So the Vikings obviously are very good in the fourth quarter. It may be that in the fourth quarter that they've begun to more proactively adjust to what's happening, or their adjustments are working, or they figured out what they need to adjust to. And it could be that they're doing that later than other teams. And if so, that means that they're not playing cornerback leverage correctly. They're not understanding that when the defense does this, because they've scouted that you do that, the defense changes what they normally do, right? A good example of this is sail versus cover 3. So sail is a route concept where you've got players essentially at all three levels of the field, all heading to one sideline. So you've got a deep route going deep downfield. You've got an intermediate route, which tends to actually also turn out to be a fairly deep route, usually from the other side of the field, called an over route, or which is Justin Jefferson's one of his favorite routes, or sometimes just called a sail route. And then you've got an underneath route going to the sideline. And against cover 3, that typically works because you've only got 2 defenders on that sideline. And so somebody's going to be open. Well, a lot of teams in cover 3, knowing that teams run sail, will carry that linebacker against that over route. Luke Kuechly was phenomenal at this particular thing. That's an adjustment that you make with your base defense, knowing what the other team is going to do. And so you need to adjust against that, knowing, hey, they're going to send their linebacker over to cover the over route. Well, we're just going to put our best receiver as the over route. Luke Kuechly's great. He can't cover Justin Jefferson, right? That's the kind of adjustment that you make. And if you understand that a team is making a certain kind of adjustment, you need to react to that quickly. So that could be one element of that. But I don't know what the entirety of it is. I know that pressure makes offenses more inconsistent. I think that that's playing a role, right? But whether or not, those two things are the whole of it, that's really difficult for me to answer.
Boy, this team every week is reminding me more and more of that Giants squad that beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl. I'm not saying the Vikings are going to win a Super Bowl. I am saying the end of their seasons look a bit similar, because that Giants team was trash at the end of the season. The Vikings beat the hell out of them for the final game of the year. Like, this was not a good team. It's also part of the reason why Eli gets as much crap as he does when they talk about potentially putting Eli in the Hall of Fame. Like, yeah, but he wasn't on any good team. Like, he wasn't the best player on his team. Like, there's no part of it. Like
ever. There's not a year. You can't name one year he was the best player on his team.
But yeah, it's just that sort of thing. So yeah, it's every game now. I'm just thinking more and more, and it feels a bit like that. Ruben asks, is there any truth to the idea that the Vikings played a pretty vanilla game plan to avoid giving away good playoff material? I'm just hunting for positives at this point.
you're coping, right? Basically coping. This is not a podcast where we distribute copium.
Or experience anything involving conspiracy theories, let's be clear.
Yeah, this is definitely an anti-conspiracy theory podcast. We've never shared one conspiracy theory on this podcast except to debunk it. So just get that out of your brain that we don't do that. That said, to answer your question, you're still wrong, actually. No, I think that if you're, and obviously the Vikings are from a record perspective in not pole position, obviously, but in a position where they can say that, we're going to make the playoffs either way. So let's make sure that we do it in a way that allows us to be more explosive in the playoffs versus now. So we're going to hide our best plays. I mean, this has happened. Teams do this. Like, I remember, I think it was Bengals Ravens played each other in week 17, and knowing that regardless of the outcome of the game, they would play each other in the playoffs. I think the only thing that would change is who had home field advantage, which obviously is important. You want to play to win, so you can secure home field advantage, especially in the 17-week, 16-game era where home field advantage was just a little bit more important than it is now. The Bengals, and this is the Marvin Lewis Bengals, the Bengals almost admitted, I mean, they didn't say it outright, but it was essentially communicated or reported, right, that the Bengals were hiding their best stuff. And they lost in the playoffs. I'm not sure that's, it seems like they lost that game and then they lost in the playoffs. I don't know that is a remarkable, lesson here. It's just kind of a one-game sample. The Bengals during that period did a lot of losing in the playoffs, which bittersweet in a lot of ways, right? But that does happen is what I'm trying to get across. I don't think that's what the Vikings are doing here, even though they know they're going to the playoffs. They know that there's a high likelihood that they'll play specifically the Packers, but teams that do a pretty good job of scouting Vikings-Packers games. I remember, when the Vikings got trounced by the 49ers, I think it was in the divisional round, right? It was 2019?
Yeah.
They got destroyed, and the 49ers essentially used the Packers game plan to destroy the bootleg rollout. Treating it like an option play, essentially. So, we know that teams do that, right? So I'm not saying that that's not something that happens in the NFL. It is. I'm saying that the Vikings are not confident enough as a team that they're good, which is a good thing. They're not, right? To do that. I think that they are more concerned at the moment, maybe down the future when they feel like the Peyton Manning Colts, right? Right now, they're not confident that they're good enough. They'd rather get right than make sure that they're hiding their best plays. Like, that's something that you do when you're Andy Reid with Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. That they're like known to do that. It's actually infuriating because it screws up a lot of statistical analysis because they're just not playing good football against bad teams. Again, mind you, they're still the number one offense in the NFL. So what does that tell you? But that's not where the Vikings are, and they know it. So I don't think that that's what happened here.
Let's go to our next question, who asks, I believe this is Max, who asks, it was silly of me to think they could fit all of the regression for the whole season into one game. I assume I
imagine that's the Colts game, right? That they're talking about, the one game, yeah.
Yeah. I assume the Packers game was forward regression in preparation for the playoffs.
Like I said, this is a copium podcast. We always entertain copium. We are copium dealers.
It's all we do. Frankly, all I believe in are conspiracy theories at this point.
Yeah, we're famously optimistic. And so I think, that one makes sense. Certainly they were banking on forward regression. I like that phrase. That's
forward regression.
That's so anti-math. That's so good.
It's so stupid. All right, a couple more things about the Packers game, and we'll just end with a couple of mailbag questions. Boy, that sucked. It would be nice if the Vikings were to be able to lose a game that's not by 30.
Sorry, was that a mailbag question?
No, that's just me being sad.
I mean, I talked about like the cleats thing and the center thing. There's just a couple of things I want to touch on a little bit. One, Justin Jefferson was okay. So first of all, this isn't to take away from Jair Alexander. Comparing him favorably to Darius Slay and Jeff Okudah, that's a compliment. That's a good thing. I know he doesn't see it that way because everybody who called him good, he was mad. Remember when Everson Griffin got mad that Mike Zimmer called him good?
Yes.
He wanted to be called great. Jair Alexander did the same thing. He called out a bunch of people that called him good, and he said, no, I'm great. So I understand that he would think that this is an insult, but he is a very good corner. I'm not taking this away from him. But he was doubled all game. Like that's just Jefferson was doubled all game. Jair Alexander had help. That's smart. That's how you should play football.
That was, by the way, that was taunting, right?
Yeah. Okay. So my take on this is that by the letter of the law, right, by the way the rule is written, no, that is not. And so they were correct from that perspective not to call it. My second take is taunting is awesome and it should not be a violation. It should not be a rule to not be able to taunt. But third, if we have taunting rules, we should generally throw flags when players taunt if we're going to do it sometimes. And that is obviously that's taunting. There's not even close. But like at some point, like refs have to read into the cultural context of what's happening. Like, he's doing that dance because he knows that player, he slept with that player's wife. And, it's just like the ref is not going to know all of the lore necessary to enforce in this case, it was like the gritty is Justin Jefferson's thing. He does the gritty. Mm-hmm. You don't need to know a lot to be able to do that. But at some point, it's just going to get deeper and deeper down the well. And the ref is not going to know it.
These poor woke refs, they're just not going to know what to do. The poor woke ref mob is not going to know like all the ins and outs of things.
Yeah, and so like if we expand our definition of taunting to say, hey, when it's like that's obviously taunting. Then we run into our own drawing the lines problems, and it's like, well, refs should not be like political opposition researchers in order to understand when something is taunting. I would rather get rid of the rule. That by rule is not necessarily technically taunting. It by any other definition obviously is taunting. If we're going to enforce taunting, throw that flag. But let's just all agree not to enforce taunting? Like, call delays of game if the taunting takes too long. Fine. But, like... Also, if we're going to... Just final note. If we are going to enforce taunting, let's also do it just for no reason. For cornerbacks that celebrate drops. That's my second... I'm going to count that as taunting.
Like, you didn't earn that. Quit dancing. Get back to the huddle.
Yeah, and, so long as we call penalties the right way, which is that there are no automatic first downs, 5 yards, maybe it was worth celebrating because, it was like 3rd and 14, right? 5 yards, no automatic first down, fine. But, that's taunting.
That's right around the touchdown dance when you're down 30.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Like, what are you celebrating exactly? Like, my favorite part about the
if they hit a contract incentive with that touchdown, they should get to celebrate twice as long, no matter the score.
Yeah,
that's my next take.
But when I was watching the Colts game, the Colts comeback and the first down that Jefferson got, like the first 3 after when they were doing their comeback, no extension, just right to business. I was like, that's Justin Jefferson. That is recognizing the situation. Now, when you...
So long as when he's not throwing his helmet at a ref, yeah,
well,
for sure.
I mean, we've all wanted to see some version of that at Lambeau at some point. So...
I bet Justice was real conflicted about that.
He doesn't... What was it? Mamas don't let your babies grow up to be refs? Like...
Yeah, his official rule... committee proposal is that refs should have their home addresses printed on the back of their jerseys. So the moment Justin Jefferson hit that ref with the helmet, which I must stress, I'm confident was extremely accidental.
Yes.
But that had to be a conflicting moment for Justice.
That was something he's going to have to think about for a while as an owner, especially.
Yeah, definitely as an owner, right? I mean, given that he's empowered to submit rule proposals.
Oh, God. I had somebody who's not like into football try to convince me that the Packers thing was real and like they were actually like a democratic thing. And I was like, what are
Oh,
you?
like it was a real ownership that tried to
Yeah.
convince you of that?
Yeah. I was like, you don't know, A, you don't know anything about football, but B, I appreciate your opinion on this. However, no, this was an NFT before NFTs were NFTs.
Yeah, yeah.
Try
It was a physical
transferring that.
NFT.
Yeah, try transferring that certificate you got there, like, to your kids. It's not the same.
Yeah, which actually would make it a fungible token,
It
right?
would.
It's not even as uh I don't even know why they choose the words they do. It's not even as NFT as NFTs because you can't even transfer it. You can transfer an NFT. That's crazy. Um anyway, back to the original. So Jefferson, Jair Alexander doubled. Jefferson did get open a couple of times and Kirk didn't throw it to him. That's frustrating, right? Kirk had certainly not nearly as bad as a game as the statistics would indicate. Two of those interceptions, I would argue, are not his fault. One obviously hit the hands of TJ Hawkinson. Still a bad read. We'll get into that in a second. And the second tipped at the line of scrimmage, which, someone in my replies was like, Arif, if it's tipped, that's on the quarterback a little bit. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. It really depends on the nature of the tip. If it's just a really well timed play and you're not giving a read on how you do, I mean, it's different, right? But also Justin Jefferson fell down on the route, and so just sailed over him, and it was a pick. That said, Cousins made a number of poor decisions. So the throw, for example, to Hawkinson, Kirk mentioned that he wanted to throw it into a void. There was nothing there. Hawkinson was very well covered, but it turns out Jefferson was wide open. And Cousins didn't trust the progression long enough to stick with it. Another moment, which did it occur on a strip sack? Luke tweeted it out of the option route. It was open on the broadcast. I believe the announcers even talked about it, right? When the pressure, or was it on the strip sack? Where the pressure arrived and Kirk had taken his eyes off of Jefferson. Jefferson was being covered by Preston Smith, who is an edge rusher. It'd be like if Cooper Kupp was covered by Anthony Barr. I don't know. That guy is open. Like, he's going to get open. And he did, it turns out. Like, he was even wearing the right cleats at that point in the game. He was open. And Kirk took his eyes off of that and held on to the ball too long, and it led to a strip sack. So, and those are just two examples. I think throughout the game, there were moments where we saw Jefferson break open. There was one where he's open on a double move. Actually, no, that was the Hawkinson one. Nate Tice tweeted that out. But there were a couple of moments where Jefferson was open, not nearly as open as it would make sense to design an entire game plan and force the ball to him like they did against the Eagles, right? But fairly open for them to be able to rack up 50, 60 yards through the air in that direction that would have sustained some key drives. Cousins was late to a couple of reads. This is not to say Cousins had a capital B bad game. He had a fine-ish game. He didn't play very well, but he didn't play very poorly. That's my take on how Cousins. When that happens, when your quarterback is not playing spectacularly, in order for you to win, everyone else has to be playing great. And barely anyone was even playing good. And so that's Duke Shelley stands alone, right? It's like him. Daniil Hunter was all right. That's it. I think I ran out of the good players in that game. So if the quarterback can't do it, if your superstar receiver can't do it, everybody else kind of has to fill in the gap, and they weren't doing that. That's kind of how the game went. Defensively, the Vikings were just a huge mess. I think that the results of their play actually not that bad. I know they gave up 41 points kind of technically, but in honesty, they gave up 27 points, right? Because there's the kickoff return touchdown, the punt block. And so those are the 14 points. They gave up 27 points, but they gave up 27 points in bad field position caused by turnovers, whether it was because of Cousins or a missed field goal. There were two of those in this game. Or a fumble or something like that, right? Where some kind of turnover, including turnovers on downs, put the Packers in good field position. The Packers, I believe, did not score. No, No, that's not true. They scored a lot. But the Packers primarily scored their 27 points off of all of those turnover type plays. So they didn't score off of any field position that they gained on a kickoff. It's not to say they didn't score off of a kickoff. That definitely happened.
I hate that Justice called that happening.
That's so... The worst part of any of this is that when Justice gets something right, it's usually an accident. He's blinder than Luke. But, squirrel nut, right? So, but the problem is his ego grows 3-4 sizes that day. And as a capitalist owner, that stings particularly.
It does. It's really unfortunate. The moment that I saw he was like 7 yards back and he started to bring it out, I just went, oh, Justice talked about this. Oh my God, he's going to do it.
Yeah. And he tweeted at me all pro. That's all he said. It hurts so much, man. They should have waited 2 more weeks to make him the kickoff returner, because then he wouldn't have gotten the votes to be all pro. We'll see.
If there's one thing we hate on this show, it's when it's when a guest is right about something. In this particular
we despise that. We bring them on so that they can tell us about their teams with a high degree of expertise and tell us about the game with no expertise whatsoever.
Yeah, that's why we're here. Let's knock out a couple of mailbag questions here before we wrap up. Joe Glissick asks, for a Reef's point differential corner, what's the Vikings point differential in games that Tony Romo calls? I'm setting the over-under at -77.5.
I think the under means it's worse, right? Because negative numbers. So I'm going to take the under. I'll research this one later.
It's bad. It wasn't a noon game, so here we are. Draw Play Dave asks, are you looking forward to the Fraud Bowl in the wild card round?
So the Vikings could still technically play the Packers, right? Draw Play Dave, obviously, Giants fans talking about the fraudulent Giants playing the fraudulent Vikings, but it's possible that the fraudulent Vikings play the fraudulent Packers instead. Certainly, we're going to have a return of the Fraudcast. We're going to have Fraudcast 2.
Yeah. That seems...
The Reckoning?
Fraud Harder?
Fraud Harder.
That'll be the show name for it. Tim Rizzo asks, who would you rather play in emergency for the Vikings this weekend? Andre Smith or Jake Long? Also, can someone please explain to me why on Jerome Wiggins' green earth, Kevin O'Connell was playing starters so late into the game? I know he came back from massive holes, but Kirk in the fourth seems borderline negligent.
I mean, you pull off the greatest comeback in NFL history, like 3 weeks after you pull off the greatest comeback of the season. Can you blame him that much? I get it. How do you not believe in this dumb team, right? They've tricked you. They've drugged you with belief. Yeah, I get it. Also, I guess with Kirk, this isn't true because you could just play Nick Mullins, which eventually they did, but you don't have that many active starters. I mean, you don't have like 5 backup offensive linemen. Like famously, the Vikings can't, right? But generally, you don't have 5 backup offensive linemen. You're going to play some starters. You don't have, 3 backup receivers. You're going to play some starters. Usually, you don't have 3 backup receivers. So you're going to have to play some starters, right? The question is for how long, when, and how, and who, right? But yeah, they're a great fourth quarter team if that's a real thing, and certainly they seem to think it's a real thing. So, yeah.
Let's go to Kenneth Allen, who asks, "Are the Vikings the third best team in the NFC North?"
Okay, so Eric Eager tweeted out that the Vikings are the third best team in the NFC North, which, I mean, Eric has a lot of fun poking at Vikings fans. I think Sam said it on the show best on Minnesota Football Party. When we call the Vikings frauds, we get to do that. That's our team. When they call the Vikings frauds, that's bad and annoying, and we got a dogpile about that.
They can't do that to our. It's the you can't do that to our pledges. Those are our pledges,
right? Exactly. There are pledges.
This is the Animal House thing.
Yeah. Only we get to. Yeah, so that's why people got mad at Peter. But the thing is, I mean, Eric grew up here. He's kind of a Vikings fan. He's a Vikings hater from the perspective of a fan, I think is the closest we can get to accurately describing his relationship with the team. He's also a huge, it's like a bit mostly, a huge Lions fan. It started this season. It's all a bit, but bits eventually become things. I'm just genuinely cheering for Case Cookis at this point, right? So like that bits just become part of who you are. And so that all gets rolled into it. Plus, he's been calling the Vikings frauds, again from halfway inside the house. So it's been mostly okay, as opposed to the Joneses across the street doing it. But yeah, the Vikings are better than the Lions. Just not by enough.
By the way, speaking of the Lions, did you see that Jeremy Reisman got sent in a
Yes.
wreath sticker?
That's beautiful. Did you do that?
I didn't do that. No, I should have.
What? Oh my God, that's amazing.
Nope, somebody did that for him. Not to him, for him. They thought he needed
for
it.
him. So that it would enlighten him to the importance of selling sticker merch.
Exactly. Kenneth Allen asks, how in the world are the Vikings now 28th in DVOA? Does this tell us anything about the limits of DVOA as an advanced statistic, or are the Vikings really a bottom 5 team in the NFL?
I think if you asked Aaron Schatz, who designed DVOA, he would probably tell you that he doesn't think the Vikings are a bottom 5 team. I could just ask him. I mean, I know him. We're friends. I've been on his shows a couple of times, so maybe I should do that. But sometimes you just end up in that situation where a statistic that you design does a very good job predicting things on a fairly broad scale at a somewhat universal level. The issue is DVOA is only better than EPA in one key element, which is that they adjust for their opponent. DVOA was one of the most important things from an analytical perspective that someone had done with football data before Brian Burke arrived with advanced football analytics. He eventually became the director of stats and research at ESPN. It's hard to overstate, I know fans didn't use it a ton, but it's hard to overstate how important it was in the analytical football world. Aaron Schatz did a remarkable job designing DVOA, and it's built around success rate and explosiveness. He built his definition of success rate off of what is probably the Bill James equivalent to football in a book called The Hidden Game of Football, which has 3 authors. I believe 2 of them are Carroll and Palmer. I wish I remembered the other one. And their definition of success rate builds off of essentially the way coaches think of football, generally speaking, which is you get 40% of the yardage required to convert on first down. That's a success, 40% or more. So 4 yards on 1st and 10, right? Or on second down, I shouldn't say or, and also a success is 60% of the required yardage needed to convert on second down. So 6 yards on 2nd and 10, right? Or 100% of the yards you needed on 3rd and 4th down. Those are all successes. That correlates fairly well with NFL success and wins, right? Also, it's good to be explosive. So the percentage at which you can create plays that are, I believe, 15 plus yards, maybe it's 20 plus yards. I don't know which definition he uses. Those are successes. You combine them at certain weights and you create value over you create value and then you do it against the league average. So you create value over average and then you adjust for opponent, you get defense adjusted value over edge. Well, those successes and explosiveness, those are basically what EPA does at a more granular level. They know whether or not you did more than the average team in this situation based off of field position, down, and distance for every single down and distance instead of crudely estimating it based off of, 1st and 10 or whatever, right? Because if you get 40% of the required yardage you need on 1st and 30, that is not enough. You're in a bad spot. And the plays that you're designing are not designed to only get you 40%, right? Conversely, if you get 90% of the yardage you need on 3rd and 30, you did a phenomenal job. That's a success if you plan on going for it on 4th down. Those are different, right? And those edge cases are accurately captured by EPA. So EPA is more granular and more specific. But here is another innovation. I should have said there's a second thing that DVOA does better. They do a better job of accounting for high leverage plays that are infrequent, things like fumble. So when a fumble happens, DVOA marks that as a 50% recovered fumble. And so fumbles are not treated by their expected points outcome. That is a difference. So that's important. Interceptions are not treated by their expected point outcome. Interceptions are capped in terms of the impact that they have on DVOA. That's good. That improves its predictiveness, actually. So that's good. EPA does not do that. When Ben Baldwin tested EPA against DVOA, and remember, DVOA does the thing I mentioned with the fumbles, and it adjusts for your opponent. EPA is more stable in season, so early season predicts future EPA, or early season EPA predicts future EPA better than DVOA does. It definitely does it over the final 8 games a lot better than DVOA does, and it does better at predicting future seasons. This is not a criticism of DVOA, but rather a demonstration that EPA is better. EPA has the Vikings ranked higher than 28th by, I'm not going to say a substantial margin, but a pretty good margin. Those edges are kind of where some of these teams get lost in DVOA. Again, a phenomenal tool. Largely speaking, it'll tell you how good a team is much better than most of the metrics that people use, things like total yards, things like even points, right, and point differential. But there are just edge cases where it just doesn't capture something in the way that EPA does. We should probably default to the idea that if a team is consistently racking up wins, unless there's a preponderance of evidence, and in the Vikings case, there kind of is, but generally speaking, unless there's a preponderance of evidence, there's probably something that we're missing. Now, in this case, the Vikings are bad to below average to even just average in a number of stable statistics that are important to understand. So there is probably something to be said about how the Vikings are actually just kind of an average team that's getting a little bit lucky in some circumstances. But those are all statistics that still say the Vikings are better than that DVOA. And so I think that they're just not capturing edge cases really well, and the Vikings, for whatever reason, are hitting those edge cases a lot.
Damian Bolsharif asks, why can't a team who wins so many one-score games lose a one-score game?
They can't. It would be embarrassing. It would hurt their one-score game record. There was a soccer game, was in the 90s, where the rules were written in such a weird way that it was actually better for one of the teams to lose, or to lose by a certain specific point differential. And so they intentionally scored own goals in order to advance them into World Cup qualification. Very weirdly written rules, probably works 95% of the time, but here's a case where it doesn't. I think the Vikings are in a situation where if they're about to lose a one-score game, they'll just fumble in the end zone. We can't have that.
No.
We're just going to give you a touchdown.
Yeah.
That way it's a multiple score game.
Noah asks, for James's Eternal Punishment Corner, for the 3rd straight year, I have won a Norse Code Fantasy League. Clearly, fantasy sports are just too easy. Do you have any idea how to make it more difficult? Even with your missed extra point, winning the league is easy as hell.
Hold on, before you answer, James, is Noah in a Hell League?
Yes, he is.
James has ideas.
Yeah, if you're going to start being a little bit too cocky about this sort of thing, boy, the Hell League was originally a sandbox, but I can get real interesting with just a kicker-only league.
I like that this league also has safeties. I had to choose between Harrison Smith and Tafunga, Heleno Tafunga every week, and I often picked wrong, but it was fun.
I picked the Packers safety this week. Turned out to be a good plan.
Yeah, any of the three, honestly. Yeah,
I can't even remember which. I just know that it went well. Noah, we're gonna need to talk about your commitment to Sparkle Motion here. I think I got some ideas that we can do here. Let's end with Kevin. A number of great questions, by the way. were asked to the show, we're not going to go too deep on some of the funnier stuff. We're going to save that for the next episode we tape, which we'll talk about that after we answer this question. Kevin asks, I had to suffer yesterday's loss with my wife's family, who are all Packers fans. They had a lot of smack talk because they know I'm a good sport about it. Arif or James, can you share a moment where you had to go through a similar experience? It might just make me feel better.
I guess the closest is when I was on a debate team. I tell way too many debate team stories on here. But there was a team that my debate partner and I had beaten like 9 times in a row. They just couldn't do anything against us. And I genuinely did not remember them. And so when we faced off against each other the 10th time, it was an elimination round. You know, they're like, man, we've debated each other so many times. And I turned to my partner and I was like, dude, have we? Who are these people? And they heard me and they got so mad, which they should have. They were totally in the right to, because it wasn't me attempting to style on them. I did not remember. They got so mad that they pulled out, I guess, this file or this case that they had saved for later on in the elimination rounds, which, if I'm being honest, was fairly ambitious of them given their record. But they were right to do it, and they absolutely clowned us. We got destroyed. We deserved it. We got destroyed. And I did not hear the end of it for the next 2 years.
Wow.
Do you remember us now, Arif? Yeah, I get it. You're 1-17 against me, okay?
You had the Raul Julia M. Bison thing. To me, it was Tuesday. This was the day that Arif came to your village. To me, it was Tuesday.
Which, we got that movie. That guy, Raul Julia, killed it. He had no reason. The rest of the movie was awful. He had no reason to kill that line.
No,
nobody nail that role.
That movie is so hilariously bad, except for every time he comes onto the screen. It is so good.
He's chewing through the scenery, like, for no reason.
It's like the Muppet. I was comparing it one day to the Muppet Christmas Carol movie, where it's just like where Michael Caine just goes ham the entire movie. You're just like, oh, we're going to settle in for a Christmas movie with Michael Caine giving the performance of a lifetime.
That's incredible. Right before we move on, one last thing. Game Changers I shouldn't say they did it in 2020, but I'm going through. Game Changers is the College Humor /Dropout.tv game show, and it's a different game show every week. It's very funny. It's a bunch of actually good improv comedians doing really incredible stuff for points. It's very funny. It's my favorite series right now. And in season 3, they're doing everything over Zoom because it's the pandemic. And the host has gathered the 3 contestants because he considers them to be some of the best actors in College Humor, which is pretty high praise. They're all very good actors. And he makes them read lines with a tone that is totally discordant with the awful dialogue that he had written. And they do a really good job. And then he brings in, I don't know, should I spoil this, James?
He brings in a very famous actor to go against them.
Yeah. And not just a famous actor, one that is like, because there's like famous actors who are like not that great at acting or have a reputation for not being great at acting, or the thing that they're good at is not necessarily line reading. And they brought in one of the best line readers of all time.
Yeah, that's got to be a show notes link.
Yeah, it was a slaughter. It was fantastic. I highly recommend it.
Well, as far as my experience goes, I was engaged to a Packers fan for a number of years.
That's right.
Yeah, mother of my kid. So I wouldn't know anything about what you're going through or what you've experienced. I've never had to deal with anything of the sort, and I wish you well in your new experience. Clearly, God, I never had to sit and watch the Packers win a Super Bowl either. Never.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that would be like. That would be awful.
God, that was just the worst. On the plus side, Aaron Rodgers hasn't made it back since, so I do like to just occasionally point that out.
Remind him.
Yeah, well, that. Well, that's going to be the end for this episode of Norse Code. We're hoping to put something together later this week with a potential interview with Lauren Cox. Arif is going to be traveling, so we'll see what's possible, but we'd like to put out another episode here in the next couple of days. Likely it'll just end up being the interview, but we'll see what we got and all that. So if nothing else, Arif, let's talk about what you have to plug.
All right, so I wrote 2 pieces. One was off of the Vikings-Packers game, which I think I did a pretty good job with that piece, and then it suddenly kind of doesn't matter. I wrote a Mar Hamlin piece. I referenced it earlier in the show. People seem to really appreciate it, which I'm really grateful for because it's very difficult to write in a very short period of time. That's what I have over Pro Football Network. I actually don't know what my content schedule going forward is going to be, but I'm probably not going to touch that particular topic again. Like James said, I had the one thing to say. I'm not a subject matter expert. I don't know them, and I'm not going to be able to provide medical updates. That's kind of what matters. So I'm probably going to be kind of doing stuff like updating quarterback rankings or providing a preview for a particular team, talking about Week 18 scenarios, that sort of thing. So that's over at profootballnetwork.com.
Well, that's me it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. For Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much, and we'll be back next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog, at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan of Pro Football Network, and he can be found at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can do so in a few different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. For $3.50 a month, you get bonus material and more. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up some Norse Code merchandise. Any questions or comments that cannot fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this.
Hey, all things are possible through the power of Ben DiNucci.